A second degree AV block type 1. Um, what second degree type 1 is, you also may hear people calling it Wenke block. You might read that in some texts or whatnot. Medicine is kind of getting away from naming things after the people who discover them. So in most newer texts and literature, you're just going to see second degree type 1. And what happens during a second degree type 1 is that the impulse traveling through the AV node gets slowed down and slowed down and slowed down until it gets to a point where it can't cross anymore into the His bundle and into the ventricles. And what you will end up with is that a P wave but no QRS complex. And we call that a dropped beat. Now, as a result of this, while you're looking at your strip, what you'll see is going to be prolongation of the PR interval till, like I said, till a beat drops. And the main concern with the second degree type 1 AV block is going to be the decreased cardiac output, especially if you're having a patient with a second degree type 1 who is having a really slow heart rate. Now, let's look at this image right over here, and what A, B, and C are here presenting here is that let's say these are three consecutive impulses coming from the SA node, and over here you have a picture of the AV node, and then so we know that this area, the compact zone of the AV node, is where the conduction is slowed down, and then the star over here is representing the trigger zone. So what happens is that once this impulse A comes from the SA node and down the internodal pathways and hits the AV node, it does what it normally should do. It slows down, hits the trigger zone, and then fires down the His bundle and into the ventricles. And what you will end up with is going to be a P wave and a QRS complex, like you should. Now, in this image, what happens is that you have impulse B coming right after impulse A. As you may recall, I hope you do, is that the cardiac cells have an all or nothing property. And what that means is that when it comes to your cardiac cells, once a cell is stimulated, it either depolarizes or it doesn't. So if an impulse hits a cardiac cell that is in relative refractory period or in a resting stage, then that cardiac cell is going to depolarize. If it's in an absolute refractory period, then it is not going to. So what happens during in a normal heart, for a normal person that doesn't have an AV block, is that 99% of the AV node cells are basically sharing the same threshold. So what happens is that once an impulse hits them, they depolarize, they give you a QRS complex, right? They allow the impulse to travel down the His bundle into the ventricles to give you a QRS complex. So what happens in a diseased heart, whether it's as a result of MI, old age, ischemia, whatever the case may be, what happens is that the cells in the AV node, they will start having different threshold. So they don't all depolarize and repolarize at the same time. So once that impulse A in the last image came and hit the area, it depolarized some of the cells that were in this area, and the impulse traveled. Now, what happens is that once impulse B hits the AV node, some of these cells have already depolarized. So it will have to travel through this, let's say, checkerboard of cells that haven't depolarized yet, and then depolarize those cells. So the impulse will travel even slower, but it hits the trigger zone and travels down. So what you will have is a P wave and then a prolonged PR interval because the impulse is traveling even slower. Now, if we go to the next image where the impulse C hits, well, there are no more cells left to depolarize. They're all in absolute refractory period and they're not ready to repolarize. So what happens is that the impulse hits this area and comes to a complete halt and never makes it to the trigger zone to travel down the His bundle. So what happens is impulse C hits. So here's your impulse A, P, normal PR interval, QRS complex. Here's your impulse B. you have your P wave, a longer PR interval, and a QRS complex. And then what happens is that once the impulse C hits, you will not have a QRS complex with that because the impulse never traveled down the His bundle, and that's where your dropped beat will be. I wanted to put this picture in here to kind of show you that. Here's the interesting part with the second degree type 1. This over here is meant to show you your P to P interval. And what happens is that you will have a P to P interval that will march down your strip from left to right. So your P's are falling exactly where they should. It's just that the PR intervals are getting longer and longer and longer, but your P's will march out. So what you will end up with is a rhythm that has a regular atrial rhythm, but an irregular ventricular rhythm. So if you're ever in a situation where you're looking at a strip and your P's are not marching out from left to right and you have dropped beats, what you're looking at is not a second degree type 1. You're looking at something else. Because in a second degree type 1, this is not an atrial problem. This is not a SA node problem. So all of your P's will march out. All right, so the characteristics. Rate could be normal to slow. Regularity, like I said, you will have a normal, regular atrial rate, but an irregular ventricular rate. So basically all your P waves will be regular and your ventricular rate, your QRS complexes will be irregular. P waves will be present. And then here's your P to QRS ratio. PR interval will be widening. And then the QRS complexes can be narrow or wide. Remember, this is not a ventricular problem. All right, here's a couple of examples. Here they're showing you your PR interval, getting longer and longer and longer. And then over here, you have a P wave and no QRS complex. And then the AV junction resets and you go back to your normal rhythm. So here's another example. Once again, you have P wave, QRS complex. P wave, a longer PR interval, QRS complex. P wave, no QRS complex. Now, I am not the one to support memorizing things. I truly believe that you should understand things because once you understand something, then you will never have to memorize it. And I also believe that you should assess every single strip and every single rhythm and every single patient individually. But having said that, if you are a paramedic student, if you're new to cardiology, if you're a nurse, taking a pre-employment test or something like that, if you're taking any kind of rhythm interpretation test, here's a cool trick. If you're ever wanting to know if you have a second degree type 1 or a second degree type 2 block, it is super easy. Forget about everything else on this strip. Just find your P wave and your dropped beat. And then what you want to do is that look at the PR interval after and the PR interval before that dropped beat. If there are two different measurements, which there clearly are here, it's always going to be a second degree type 1. If your dropped beat was here and your PR interval after and your PR interval before were exact same measurement, that would always be a second degree type 2, which is what we'll cover in the next video. Thanks again for watching. Doing some kind of activity, playing basketball, running. You might read that